to figure out what was going on. And back in the day when this first started, and the laws have changed, thank God, but when this first started, it used to be that police couldn't arrest anybody if the drug wasn't officially on the books. So what he was doing is a designer drug that was just to the left of, does that make sense? So it had the effects of, the intent was to have the effects of a drug that would be on the books, but it was chemically different, so he could evade the law. So I guess the lawyer part came in handy, actually. And then he wasn't good at what he did, and we'll talk about that in a second, and part of how police figured out is because he blew up his garage at one point. Whoops. Anyway, so really not good at it. But what he did is he rushed the synthesis, and he used too much heat. He actually ended up creating mostly byproduct, and the byproduct was super toxic, and you're going to see the effects of that. So this actually, I like to show right after the test that you just took, because it actually, components of it are going to piggyback on the idea of the end of air assay. And when you put a substance in from the outside, you know, your body doesn't fight that substance because it's not in it and all of that. So you're going to see some footage that's reenacted, and it's clear which stuff is reenacted, but you're also going to see footage that was shot at the time. So when you see the clients who are moving extraordinarily slowly from the impact of the designer drug, that's in real time, and that's actual footage of the actual clients. And then you're going to see doctors trying to solve the medical problem.
Did you do it for like medical purposes, like pharmaceutical, or it was just for, okay.
No, it was not a noble endeavor. It was let me be a designer drug manufacturer to make a little money on the side. Yeah. Okay. Now this is me using technology, so hold on. So if you know any magical prayers, now's the time to say them. It's me, tech. You guys are like, we've seen, it doesn't work well. I'm just too far at the beginning of this. That doesn't look like that's on. Does that look like anything's on? But if I turn that off, it won't work, so I don't know. The lights on. It's the switcher thing they warned me about. It's really cheap equipment. Okay, this should have sound. Do you hear sound? I hear no sound. Okay, so hold on, that's the switcher. I don't know what that's called. Does anyone know what that's actually called, the device in here that switches between different modalities? Is there a name for that? No. Okay, so if I say switcher, that's like close enough. I'm sure that's not what it's called, but I don't know what it's called. Okay. Please work. Please, 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 please.
In 1989, an extraordinary and controversial operation, but the organ was not a heart, kidney, or liver. They were brain cells harvested from an aborted fetus. A lot was riding on this operation. If it worked, it might lead to a cure for a terrible brain condition affecting millions. Over the next 5 hours, a skillful team of surgeons and scientists would journey deep into this patient's brain and plant fetal cells with pinpoint accuracy. This patient was no ordinary patient. He was of special interest to the scientific community because of an event that happened in the summer of 1982. One day in July, his life had taken a tragic turn, setting in motion one of the most extraordinary stories in recent medical history. On July the 16th, 1982, George Carrillo awoke to find he could not move or talk.
George, I'm just going to flash a light in your eyes. Let's see. Let's take a look at that.
Doctors had no idea what was wrong.
I had never seen anything like it, and I think no one else on the ward at the time had either. In fact, an argument had broken out between the psychiatrist and the neurologist the neurologist thinking that it was a psychiatric disorder, catatonic schizophrenia, something like that, and the psychiatrist thinking it was neurologic. So he had everybody buffaloed.
I love that quote because usually people are like trying to figure out the problem, but this one is complicated, so everybody's like, it's yours. Does that make sense? Like it's nobody knew what to do with it. It's like it's not our.
Dr. Langston, George was not an isolated case. 50 miles to the south at the Watsonville Community Hospital, 2 other patients had turned up with symptoms that were equally bizarre and equally mysterious. 2 brothers had been found by their mother lying frozen in their apartment, unable to move or talk. David Silvey and his brother Bill. 2 healthy young men in their 20s had become invalids overnight. 100 miles to the north, languishing at the Stanford Medical Center, was another case. A young girl of 25 called Connie Saints. Stanford's doctors were mystified. After 2 weeks of tests, they concluded that her problem was all in her mind and sent her home, saying that in time she would snap out of it.
Now you need to keep in mind, so intellectually they're normal. So she's carrying that diagnosis, does that make sense, and all of that stuff, and she knows she can't move. And you have to also imagine how scary it would be and how frustrating. For the Silvey brothers, both of them, one started getting a little bit better function. The level of symptoms depends on how strong a dose of the side product they got, how much they got before, obviously they had the impact that we're going to talk about in a minute. One of them had a little bit more movement, but if the mother hadn't come, there's no way to know would anyone have checked on them. Does that make sense? Because if you're frozen, obviously you can't call for help. Okay, and those kinds of things. Oh my God.
Back in San Jose, George Carrillo was no better. Unable to communicate with their patient, there was little the doctors could do. Then, one morning, noticing he could move his hand very slowly, they had an idea. They gave him a pencil and asked him to write.
George, what we're going to ask you to do, if you can hear
And
me.
he could. He wrote the following words. I can't move right. I know what I want to do. It just won't come out right. Astonishingly, inside this frozen body was a normal mind. By question and answer, Langston and Ballard discovered who he was and what he did. George told them he had a girlfriend who had frozen up as well, called Juanita Lopez. But when they asked what he and Juanita had taken recently in the way of medicines, he gave a strange reply. Heroin. George's clues didn't make sense at first, but when Langston and Ballard heard about the other cases in Watsonville and Stanford, something clicked. The patients had only one thing in common. George and his girlfriend Juanita. David Silvey and his brother Bill. And Connie Saints were all drug abusers. They had all recently taken heroin. Soon, it was discovered that Connie's boyfriend Toby had also frozen up. Langston called a press conference to warn addicts there was some very dangerous stuff on the street.
Basically, it's a profound slowing of all motor function. The patients are not able to talk, move, feed themselves, eat. Mentally, we think they're okay inside.
Dr. Langston says this drug has a characteristic of a burning sensation when injected. He recommends anyone who thinks they have used that drug during May or August of last year contact a doctor right away.
The police gave some of the mysterious heroin to Langston and his colleagues, who began a painstaking analysis of why it was poisoning California's addicts.
Brown.
Remarkably, it would turn out that the drug was not derived from the opium poppy, nor from any natural product. It was typical of a new type of drug turning up on the street, packaged and sold like heroin, but made from chemicals in an underground laboratory, a so-called designer drug.
Designer drug. Okay.
Instead of giving a high, this chemist's concoction had turned people into statues.
Can you say your name for me, Connie?
As Langston cared for his sick addicts, he was struck by the remarkable similarity of their symptoms to a disease of the elderly called Parkinson's disease.
Take some notes.
Parkinson's disease usually affects the over 50, comes on very slowly over a number of years. Remarkably, the young addicts seem to have contracted it overnight.
These addicts exhibited virtually every one of the signs that we see in Parkinson's disease, and it was pure. Parkinson's disease is one of the two most common degenerative diseases of aging, Alzheimer's being the other, and this drug mimicked or replicated virtually all of the symptoms and signs of Parkinson's disease. The first is tremor, a shaking of an extremity, a rhythmic shaking of an extremity. The second one is a slowness of movement. Movements take much longer to execute. The third is rigidity. The arms and legs become actually stiff. And this rigidity has an unusual quality to it. It's kind of a ratchety or jerky quality. We call it cogwheel rigidity because it kind of snaps. Almost no other disease does that. After that, there's a large number of symptoms. The most common that most people would recognize is a slow shuffling gait, short steps, shuffling with the patient flexed over, bent. This is very characteristic of Parkinson's disease. A loss of facial expression and an inability to blink spontaneously, which makes the patient look like they're staring.
Because of the similarity to Parkinson's disease, Langston decided to start them on the standard medication, a drug called L-Dopa.
So they often have like involuntary staring and loss of facial expression. In the back, can I have you hit the lights really quick? You're like, the one flaw sitting here, I have to run. So these are some major symptoms of Parkinson's. And again, these addicts that got the designer drug, they have like overnight. So it's not traditional Parkinson's, but the symptoms look like that. So what they decided to do was to put the folks on L-Dopa. L-Dopa is a precursor to dopamine. You can't just give me dopamine, it can't cross the blood-brain barrier. But if you give them L-Dopa can cross the blood-brain barrier, then it gets converted to dopamine. Now, this is going to look like a miracle. And it's going to be like, hallelujah, look, everything's great, it's 8 grams, okay? But remember at the bear, so if you take a substance from the outside, the body reads it as an outside substance, so then the 4 synaptic events will fight. Does that make sense? So what looks, and then they're going to get tolerance, and then they'll start eating more of the drug to get the same effect, and on and on and on. So that's going to happen to them. And you guys know, I assume from Psych 1, and even in my class, it depends on how much time I had when I taught Psych 1. Parkinson's and schizophrenia, they're not the same disorder, but they're sort of on a dopamine continuum. Have you guys all been taught that? So like Parkinson's is too low a level of dopamine, and it's not just these things. Schizophrenia oftentimes is the effect of too much dopamine. It may be that it's not just that though, it's more than that. But many folks, not everybody, many folks have increased number of receptor sites. Some studies have shown that some folks with schizophrenia have up to a 6-fold increased number of D4 dopamine receptors. So even if the same amount of dopamine is released, if I have 6 times the number of dopamine receptors, I'm going to get more neuronal firing, those kinds of things. And so what you find is that folks with Parkinson's disease are like on one extreme, too little dopamine. Many folks with schizophrenia are in the other extreme. So when these clients start being given L-Dopa, and when they start having tolerance because of the Ed-the-Bear stuff we've already talked about, they're going to need higher and higher dosages, so they're going to start getting symptoms that look similar to what? Schizophrenia. They're not going to be schizophrenic, but the symptoms will look similar. They'll start having hallucinations and a whole host of things. Just like you can have somebody who takes stimulants who starts having hallucinations. They're not schizophrenic, but the stimulant created that. I had one of my absolute favorite clients, and I so wish I knew at the time I was going to be a teacher because he would have let me record this part. When he, toward the end of his drug use career, he started having hallucinations, and his hallucinations were about the police because he was freaked out that he was using illegal drugs. He was actually a very law-abiding person and then got hooked on stuff, and so he would apparently, like if this was his living room and there were windows up here, he would get like against the wall, is how he described it, below the window like this, like plastered against the wall, and he would hear, and I can't do this, but the sound of like a walkie-talkie, he'd hear, like, okay, like, and a guy saying to another guy, go around, like, and see shadows and stuff, and nobody was there. Nobody was there, but he was like, and he would be like that, and then after a while, once that passed, then he would go outside and look around because it felt so real to him. Does that make sense? Like, are there footsteps? There were no police. But he started having symptoms that looked like it was in that direction because of drug use. So
No one knew if it would work. But the effect was miraculous. They came back to life. For the first time in weeks, they had control of their bodies. They could move and they could talk.
Nice loud voice. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17.
They could tell the world about the nightmare they had experienced.
It wasn't painful physically. It was painful mentally.
It was difficult mentally.
Yes.
Is that because you basically lost control, or was there fear, or what types of things in the body?
No, because I got control because it was fear. Yeah, I almost suffocated.
At the end there, I was completely bedridden, and my mom and my sisters had to take care of me. They had to feed me, get me out of bed, take me to the bathroom, even give me a bath.
Langston realized he might be onto something big. What had begun as a drug tragedy might help unravel one of the world's major brain diseases. L-Dopa replaces dopamine, a naturally occurring brain chemical without which we would all freeze up. Without dopamine, the thought of lifting an arm can't be translated into the act of lifting an arm.
now remember, dopamine has different functions depending on the brain region. So remember, in the nucleus accumbens, you get feelings of anticipation, of pleasure and reward, and things like that. Dopamine in the substantia nigra and that name, substantia nigra, just means black substance, gives one muscle tone and motor movement. It gives motoric movement in this brain region, okay? So when you don't have enough of it, you go in this direction. Does that make sense? If you have way too much, some folks, not everybody, but some folks with schizophrenia who have the effect of too much dopamine, you can start sometimes getting unusual movements with their body and things like that. And so it's called substantia nigra because you'll see it looks like black pigmented cells, and that's why it's called that. And they're going to show you in just a second.
If enough of the brain cells that make dopamine die, people get Parkinson's disease. The characteristic tremor, increasing rigidity, leading eventually to complete disablement. Langston realized that in the frozen addicts, the process was speeded up hundreds of times. Something in the heroin had passed into the brain, and avoiding every other structure had destroyed just that small area of the brain that makes dopamine, the substantia nigra. To understand this toxin might be to begin to understand Parkinson's disease. By now it was clear what the underground chemist had done. He had been trying to make a substance called MPPP. Chemically quite unlike normal heroin, it nevertheless produced a heroin-like high. Unfortunately, he rushed the synthesis, and instead of making MPPP, he made a substance called MPTP.
So this is that Saratoga attorney. So he was trying to make MPPP. But he used too much heat and he rushed the synthesis. In fact, when police found his equipment, and I don't know, it's not a beaker, there's a name for it. I should know what this is, and every time, it's like a big, giant, thick glass, huge jar with, it's got the heavy lid that you do. There's a name for that. Anyway, when they found his heavy-duty equipment, there was residue. Does that make sense? From the last job he did with the big batch of that. And the residue was 90% byproduct. Okay, so when I'm saying, like, as an attorney, he's not a good chemist, like, truly not a good chemist. Now, the deal with this is they're going to say this is toxic, and it is, but it's toxic in a secondary way, and I'll talk about that in a second. When Langston and them, when they were trying to figure out how, what the guy was trying to make and all that stuff, one of the parts that was in the original film that's not in this one is Langston went to Stanford University's library to pull up write-ups about MPTP. Does that make sense? Once they figured out that's what it was, and all the articles about how to manufacture MPPP and MPTP and all of that, what those were razor bladed out of the books, and so that the attorney had gone through. Does that make sense? And razor bladed out all the stuff about MPPP and all that stuff when he was trying to figure out how to manufacture illegal drugs. So this is toxic, but it's toxic by how the body breaks it down. So you remember, so enzymes do what? They break stuff down. Okay, so it turns out with MPTP, there's an enzyme, your friend, monoamine oxidase, or MAO, which hopefully seems familiar, yes? Okay. When MAO enzymes try to break down the MPTP that this guy created, it creates MPP plus, and this is what's toxic. So does this officially count as a toxic substance? Yes, because your body automatically tries to break it down. Does that make sense? But technically it's a combination of this plus how our body breaks it down. And this one, and they're going to give the analogy for this, is that the MPP plus, and it's a superscript plus sign, is biochemically similar to ciprofloxacin and paraquat. Now, ciprofloxacin and paraquat are herbicides we spray on crops. So who thinks this sounds like a really good idea? What do you think? You're like, spray more! You're like, it sounds like a great idea to me. So it turns out that this toxin that made them frozen, we spray something that's biochemically very similar on crops that are not organic crops. And so hopefully that's going to seem like not the best idea. Yes? Okay? We're going to go through it as we watch this and just reflect on it. Okay, here we go.
This compound turned out to be deadly. Ironically, the discovery of such a deadly molecule was good news for millions of sufferers of Parkinson's disease. Scientists have been hampered in their efforts to study this disease because only humans get it. To make real progress, scientists need to study diseases in animals. Now they had a chemical, MPTP, which could induce Parkinsonism in primates. Scientists could systematically study the disease and try out new treatments. A bizarre drug tragedy had spawned a research revolution.
After the discovery of MPTP, it was like really a bracing tonic on the research field. I mean, the research field had been in the doldrums for years. Suddenly we had a new animal model. We had ways to study why cells die in Parkinson's disease. With the model, we could test new forms of drugs as fast as you could synthesize new drugs. And there are a wide variety of drugs now that have been tested. So that alone revolutionized our ability to study new forms of drug therapy. Another reason this is of tremendous scientific interest is that we now have evidence that Parkinson's is not predominantly an inherited disease. Well, if it's not inherited, at least predominantly, it must be something in the environment that's triggering it. Well, here we have a very simple toxin or molecule that, from external exposure, can replicate all of the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. That spurred tremendous interest in the possibility that the disease may be due to a chemical in the environment.
One hotly disputed theory held that pesticides and herbicides might be responsible, especially after it was discovered that MPTP was transformed in the brain into a substance with a chemical formula of an herbicide called ciprofloxacin.
So there was a huge big study that was done years and years ago in Canada where they looked at the breadbasket of Canada, and they looked at, they were basically, it's a correlational study, but it was a large study where they're looking at rates of Parkinson's disease relative to where you physically lived. So people right in the center of the breadbasket where lots of herbicides are sprayed. Does that make sense? And they mapped out the next regions out, looked at the next regions out, and all of that. And those two maps fit very closely. Now, did everybody in the breadbasket get Parkinson's? No. So it appears to be like a combination. There might be like toxic exposure that does damage to dopaminergic cells in the substantia nigra. It might be how certain bodies, does that make sense, genetically are breaking things down, a combination of multiple factors. But there was some indication that being closer to those locations where they spray those herbicides, as well as being close to locations where they did pulp and paper mill manufacture, something to do with the chemicals that they used to do that. Those two seem like environmental factors that contributed to, not the sole cause, but a contributory factor. And it's not just, again, where you have to like shoot up the drug like these folks did. It's also where, for example, the attorney who was working with the drugs, he did not ever use drugs. He wasn't a drug user. He was a drug manufacturer, and by touching those, he started getting these symptoms. It was sort of karma a little bit, okay, unfortunately. And in addition to that, there was a chemist that originally tried to create, or didn't try to, the chemist originally created MPTP, ironically to try to treat Parkinson's. This was before all this. And the guy who created it never really touched it a great deal, but then the guy who was working with it in the lab ended up getting frozen. As a result of that, and everybody at the time thought he was schizophrenic, he ended up in the lockdown ward at the hospital and all of that. When this case came out, his wife saw it and then said, this is what happened to my husband. She kept telling the doctors, like, he's not schizophrenic. Does that make sense? I don't know what's going on. She kept saying it's something to do with his work. And nobody believed her because they had no reason to. They didn't understand this stuff yet. When this case broke, she was able to get her husband treatment.
Langston's patients sat on the sidelines and watched. Their tragedy had led to a new chapter of medical research, yet their own problems were far from over.
I've always thought to the patients it must be a bitter irony that their disease has, while being so devastating for them, has led to so many research advances in Parkinson's disease. I mean, it's kind of like they gave and others have benefited. All of the patients that got MPTP that we saw originally had severe Parkinsonism. We now know there are many with mild, but the original group was severe. Their Parkinsonism was permanent. It was disabling, and the medications that we gave them, while they brought some dramatic relief, that proved to only be temporary.
Within a year or two, most of the patients found that the L-DOPA produced terrible problems. The huge amounts of L-DOPA they needed to move began causing too much movement they couldn't control.
So you have to imagine, these are young people. So let's say she's wanting to go to date, or she's applying for jobs. Does that make sense? And you're having that level of movement and that level of difficulty. When she sits with her legs crossed, she'll have trouble even uncrossing her legs to stand up. How hard would it be to be able to function at work and all those things? All of this is side effect because they had to get higher and higher dosages of L-DOPA because of tolerance.
Worse, many of the addicts began to get terrifying hallucinations.
Are you having any problem with hallucinations now? Are those coming?
No.
You having them right now?
Yeah.
Can you tell me what they're like?
Real creepy, man. Big snake from the game.
Like what?
A snake from the game.
Like a snake's coming to get you.
Yeah.
Are you seeing any strange things?
The cure is almost worse than the disease. All of our patients, with time, developed one or more of these side effects. And pretty soon, with a number of them, what we call the therapeutic window not only got smaller and smaller, but it closed. Either they were severely off and frozen and miserable, or when they turned on, yes, they could move, but they had these miserable side effects, these twisting, turning movements, terrifying hallucinations. Life, in other words, was meaningless.
These 6 patients had become a central part of Langston's life and work, especially Connie.
And at one point, I was really quite concerned she wasn't going to live much longer. She was having trouble eating. She was literally withering away, wasting, and we were all feeling very desperate and rather bleak about her prospects.
Do you like being out in the sun? Does that feel good?
With Connie, the window was completely closed. She had terrible side effects with medication. When we took her off the medication, she could not move at all. Inside there, she appears to be completely normal. At times you can even tell she still has a sense of humor, as hard as that is to believe. There we go. And I still didn't get it because it was in Spanish. Yeah.
Whereas the other addicts had all been long-term drug abusers, Connie had never taken drugs before 1982. She had paid a terrible price for her mistake.
Connie has no real meaningful day-to-day existence. She's unable to move, she's unable to feed herself, she's unable to bathe herself. If she's depressed, she can't tell anyone. If she has to go to the bathroom, she can't tell anyone. I can't imagine it. It must be worse than being in a prison cell.
Langston had nothing else to offer any of his patients. The situation looked desperate. Then something extraordinary happened. In April 1987, an article appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine describing a daring operation by doctors in Mexico City. The Mexican doctors had taken a small group of the patient's adrenal cells, which make dopamine, from their location above the kidneys and transplanted them into his brain. The dopamine these cells released gradually reversed the symptoms of Parkinson's disease, or so the Mexican team claimed. At a conference in Rochester, an audience watched spellbound as Dr. Drucker Colleen showed videotape of his patients, both before and after surgery.
Now, this is the first patient that you saw the picture on his leg. As you can see, he has extreme tremor and rigidity. He also had an orthopedic problem, which made his walking also difficult.
12 months later, it was a different story.
January, this is June 10, 1987. This is a little farm that he has in his home. And he takes care of it. He has a little store and he sells groceries and things, which he's now capable of doing. This patient was unable to take drugs before, and he's on no drugs now. Thank you very much.
And it was a bombshell. The fact that it was in the New England Journal, the fact that the improvement was so dramatic, literally set the neurologic community on fire. Could this be the answer? Could this be the thing that's going to really cure Parkinson's disease? I think much of the interest was the fact that it, not to sound too facetious, but it was simple. You take something out here and put it in there, that it looked so dramatic that it could conceivably cure this horrendous degenerative disease. I think all contributed to this. And the word I would use would be stampede.
Not everybody at the Rochester conference was so enthusiastic. The Swedish scientist Anders Bjorklund had been working on brain tissue transplants for 20 years. His team had tried adrenal transplants 2 years before, and they hadn't worked at all. Bjorklund had severe doubts about the Mexican work. And in the press conference that followed, his Swedish colleague, Patrick Brundin, was asked by a reporter to comment.
Just so the reporters know who you are. I think one should be cautious and see what the future will tell us. It's too early. I'm a bit puzzled and surprised, but I see the same films as you do, and it looks very interesting.
But puzzled and surprised about what?
No, I mean, I'm just saying that the rat data wasn't as encouraging as the clinical data, but I see the same films. The patients definitely changed.
May I just say one word? I think that in my mind, after doing so many patients, there is no question that the patients get better. I think the real question that one has to ask is for how long will they really get better?
Despite the Swedish skepticism, patients clamored for the operation, and many American surgeons began doing the adrenal transplant procedure that Drs. Madrazo and Drucker Colleen had championed. But things didn't go as expected.
The videotapes were so dramatic that people had been expecting dramatic results. And almost no one was able to replicate those very striking results of Madrazo and his colleagues in Mexico City. The second problem, which was, I think, equally important, was that the procedure was a complicated one, taking something out of the abdomen and then putting something into the brain, a craniotomy. That procedure was pretty heavy surgically and had a fairly high attendant morbidity and even mortality. So I think the complication rate was unacceptably high.
For the California patients and their families, things looked bleak.
It's hard for us because we see how she is. We all think, why weren't we more stronger with her when she was trying to quit and everything? Why did it happen? Why did all this, for something that's not even any good, and people would only understand that drugs are not good for them because of what happens to them. And it's hard because it changes everybody's lives.
But the scientific revolution they had begun was moving on. Thousands of miles away, on the island paradise of St. Kitts, Yale University researchers were using MPTP to do some extraordinary research on monkeys. First, they used this toxin to give a monkey Parkinsonism, giving it all the usual symptoms: rigidity, tremor, and slowness of movement. Then they set out to cure it, not with adrenal cells, but with cells from the brain of a monkey fetus. They dissected out cells from the substantia nigra and implanted them into the Parkinsonian monkey's brain. Remarkably, the immature fetal brain cells were not rejected, but developed to do what they were designed to do: make dopamine. A monkey that had been completely frozen was now able to groom its tail. Its Parkinsonism had been reversed. The stakes for this research were very high indeed. If such brain tissue transplants worked in humans, a whole new field of medicine might open up. But to do this in St. Kitts with monkeys was one thing. To do it on humans in the United States was quite another. Abortion is a subject which arouses strong passions. So much so that when scientists at the National Institutes of Health asked permission to research fetal transplants, some people were outraged. A ban was placed on all federal funding until the subject could be studied by an NIH panel. But when the panel decided that work should be allowed to go ahead under strict ethical guidelines, the White House kept the ban in place anyway. Many scientists, many patients, and many members of Congress were furious.
I can't see how members can look people in the eyes who are suffering from these diseases, or who have dear ones, family members who are suffering, and tell them it is better to take the fetal tissue that is dead and bury it, rather than let any of that tissue be used for a transplantation that could save someone's life.
The ban effectively killed off most U.S. research in this area. Scientists wishing to proceed needed private money and not a little courage. But in the Swedish town of Lund, fetal transplants are not at all controversial. After 2 decades of basic research, the Lund scientists had concluded that fetal transplants offered the only hope for curing diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. Back in 1985, before attempting any human cases, they had asked the Swedish Society of Medicine to initiate a public debate on the ethics of fetal transplants.
And those discussions were very open, because this is, of course, it's a very serious ethical question. You have to work in a very responsible way. But on the other hand, these are patients where we have very little to offer in this stage of the disease. And I think that it is a very positive thing to do.
From this debate came a set of ethical guidelines that most Swedish people felt comfortable with. A woman's decision to have an abortion should be completely separate from a surgeon's decision to perform a fetal transplant. A woman should not be allowed to direct her fetus to a particular individual. Donor and recipient should remain anonymous, and no money should change hands. With the ethical guidelines in place, after 30 full rehearsals,
They talk quickly, hang on. So these are the 4 guidelines they came up with. And I'm super sorry, Karen, can you hit the lights again? So a woman's decision to have an abortion, it has to be completely separate from researchers or a surgeon's use of that tissue. Does that make sense? So nobody's pressured, nobody's like, there's no shenanigans going on. It's a woman who is going to have abortion anyway, and then the tissue can be used, obviously, with permission of the person. They're not going to, like, kidnap somebody's fetal tissue and, like, run tackling out of the room. Okay, they have to get permission. She cannot direct the fetal tissue to anyone, and this one's really important because let's say that you had, I don't know, like a niece or something. Does that make sense? Who is very ill. They don't want it where somebody in the family, does that make sense, could then get pregnant, have an abortion to try to direct it to like a very ill relative or something like that. Okay, donor and recipient must remain anonymous, and no money at all can change hands in any way. Okay, and those were the 4 guidelines they came up with in Sweden. Okay, and again, it was the Swedish Society of Medicine combined with a public debate to come up with what are all the concerns people have, and these are the 4 guidelines they came up with, and then they started their research. Okay, so here we go.
and thousands of animal experiments, the Swedish team was ready. 2 patients with advanced Parkinson's disease were prepared for a fetal transplant operation. This time, there would be no videos. Following the surgery, the Swedes refused all comment for over a year while they did a series of meticulous tests. But the results were disappointing. The patients were a little better, but nothing like the results obtained in animals. There were many possible reasons. Perhaps the placing of the graft was wrong. Perhaps they used insufficient fetal material. But there might be other factors. The transplanted monkeys were young and healthy. The cause of their Parkinsonism, MPTP, was no longer present in their bodies. Most Parkinson's patients are old and frail. Their slow degenerative disease probably remains after surgery and might prevent the immature transplanted cells from growing properly. Until they knew, the Swedes couldn't justify many more such operations. In the midst of these discussions, fate took an unusual twist.
You don't need to take notes here, but I love this part.
Anders Björklund was invited to a conference in Belgium. Along with 20 distinguished scientists, he was en route by bus to the Summer Palace for a state dinner hosted by Princess Liliana, when the bus driver took a wrong turn. As the weather worsened, the driver pulled into a field to turn around and got stuck in the mud. As the scientists waited in the dark for help, Anders began talking to the man next to him, who by coincidence happened to be Bill Langston.
And of course, we began talking, as scientists do, about our projects. And the more we talked, the more we began to realize that if there was a perfect group of patients for neural grafting, it was the MPTP patients.
It was a remarkable thought. The California patients might hold the key to the future of brain tissue transplants. Their pure form of Parkinsonism made them of immense medical importance. They were young. Like the monkeys, the MPTP that caused their condition was no longer in their bodies. They did not have a continuing degenerative disease which might complicate or contaminate the transplanted cells. If fetal transplants could ever work in humans, they really should work in the MPTP patients. The Swedes were anxious to assess the possibilities and dispatched Dr. Håkan Widner to California to see if any of the patients were suitable for surgery. Widner found California a strange and exotic land. He had never encountered patients like these. Of the original 6 cases, 3 had returned to the life of crime they had pursued before their tragedy and were residing in Vacaville Jail in Northern California.
It was quite an adventure, quite an experience. It was David Silvey there who was very keen on advocating an operation for his brother Bill. Unfortunately, Bill was severely over-medicated and had severe problems with hallucinations. For practical terms, we had to get him out of jail, which we actually considered calling up his parole officer and trying to get him out of jail, and started to look into compassionate reasons for premature release and so on. But we gave that up pretty soon.
That left David Silvey himself and Toby Govia. But as candidates for a scientific research project, they were not ideal.
These patients got MPTP because they were drug abusers. And of course, many of them supported their habit through crime. And I mean, this is no secret. When you have Parkinsonism and some of the side effects of therapy that I was talking about, you can have real problems being a criminal. One of our patients burglarized a house. Well, I guess he set off some kind of alarm or something, and he rushed out of the house into the backyard to make his escape. Started to climb over the fence and went into one of these freezing spells that we talk about. His medication turned off, and he just froze as he was climbing over the fence. So apparently, when the police arrived, here was the burglar in the backyard, just like a statue, waiting for them. They said it was the easiest apprehension they'd ever made. They just had to pick him up and carry him off, the poor guy.
Well, and if you think about it, so first of all, the disaster, because you'd hear sirens, and he's frozen. You hear pat, 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 pat of people's feet, and he's frozen. It's like Mother of God, unfreeze the poor man. But if you think about it from a police standpoint, they would have said, like, get down, or whatever they would have said, and he's not moving. He's lucky that they didn't think he was doing shenanigans, because he wouldn't be able to talk. Does that make sense? And they could have thought it was some boy that he's going to then spin around and try to get them or something, but yeah, that was okay.
A number of our patients were in jail, and in fact still are. As it turned out, none of the 3 candidates in jail were selected.
David, Bill, and Toby were out of the running. 3 patients were left, all anxious to go.
Well, Anita, it's good to see you again after 3 or 4 years. I'm glad you could come down. You understand the purpose of all this is that you're being considered as possibly a candidate to go for transplantation to try to cure the Parkinsonism that you've had from MPTP for a long time.
Juanita was in terrible shape. Without medication, she froze. Yet with it, she could not control her movements at all. Her life was a living hell. The operation in Sweden was all she had to look forward to.
And again, that's all medication side effects.
Okay, that's good. Okay.
For George, the hallucinations were his worst symptom. Every day for 8 years, he had seen snakes and fire coming at him.
What's happening? What's happening?
And yet, without L-Dopa, George turned to stone.
He is encaged within his own body. And he has a clear mind and wants to get out of it when he's off, when he can't move. He can perform any movement in his mind, but he can't make his muscles do it. And it's horribly painful for him, actually, to be in that situation. While walking, he can suddenly freeze up and cannot walk any further. And that is also very typical of Parkinson. One can overcome that, for example, by asking him to lift his foot or step over a line or some obstacle. And then he can get going again. What? No one knows. It's very strange. The mechanism on how the gait is generated, so that the software, the programming in the brain, is not known really. But it must be two different systems here. And one gets fatigued and you suddenly run out of gas. Then you can switch to another program and use that for a while.
Hello. Hi, Nellie. I've got someone I want you to meet. This is Dr. Vidner. Sweet. Okay, Vidner. And we've come down to see Connie.
Can you say hello? Can you try to say hello for us?
And notice her
Oh my gosh, you did. This is Dr. Vidner, Håkan Vidner. He's come to see you.
Nice to meet him.
From Sweden. And he's one of the members of the transplant team that we've probably talked about a little bit before. And we're kind of here to evaluate you to see how you're doing. So we'll want to spend a little time talking to you and examining a few things. Is that okay?
For Langston, Connie was the most pressing case. Because of terrible hallucinations, she had been off all medication for 3 years. 3 years of being imprisoned in her body, fully conscious, but unable to move or talk. George, Juanita, or Connie? Who would the Swedes choose?
We had a number of criteria. Firstly, they had to volunteer for it. That wasn't a problem. They all wanted the operation. Secondly, we should be able to follow them in a scientific way. We wanted to have numbers, figures and tests that we could repeat over and over again, flipping hands, touching fingers and so on, so that we could prove there really was a difference.
Now the other side. Okay. Now why don't you have a seat? Stand for me. Okay, I want you to take this finger.
It's completely, very just almost completely.
But Connie cannot perform any test really. She's too severely affected. It's not. And we were a little bit anxious and afraid that we might hurt her and make things worse for her.
That's very hard.
By summer 1988, the Swedes had made their decision. 2 patients would go, Juanita Lopez and George Carrillo.
Then if you walk towards the
Langston began the long job of getting permissions for the controversial operations. There was a lot at stake, and in this political climate, the risks were huge.
All right, let's talk to Dr. William Langston. You're looking into transplants. Does this kind of a situation give you the willies at all, or is this perfectly acceptable?
I think it does give me the willies. I think everybody worries about these questions. But I think when you try to think it through, you've got to separate 2 issues, the abortion itself and what you do with that tissue. Our society has said that abortion is legal in this country. They may change that decision eventually, and then it won't be. Once the abortion's been done, my argument would be that at that point in time, it's unethical to let that fetal tissue go. If it could save a life, if it could cure a disease, why should you let it go?
You don't kill a human being, no matter how young, and then use that killed human being's body parts to, quote, heal someone else.
So essentially, this is the abortion argument.
Do not justify me.
This is the abortion argument
Yes,
all
sir.
over again.
After a year and a half of negotiations in California and in Sweden, the preparations were complete. George would travel first, and Juanita a month later. Thus it was that on August 13th, 1989, George Carrillo wandered out into the California sun, accompanied by Dr. Håkan Widner. George was leaving on a historic trip to a strange land half a world away for an operation on his brain which might turn his life around. George Carrillo, who had never been out of Santa Clara County, would spend the next 15 hours traveling across the globe. Before his tragedy, George had lived at the margins of society. He had been a drug dealer, a petty criminal, in and out of jail. But fate had given him a new role. Now, he was a medical celebrity. The outcome of George's and Juanita's operations would be written up in medical journals and might directly affect the possibilities of a cure for Parkinson's disease. The Swedish surgical team is among the most experienced to be found anywhere in the world. Everything has to be done with complete precision. The neurosurgeon must plan the best route into George's brain, allowing the fetal material to reach its precise destination while avoiding major blood vessels. Elsewhere in the hospital, another team member, Patrick Brunden, carefully dissects the remains of an 8-week fetus, extracting the dopamine-making cells of the substantia nigra.
The most important thing is that the tissue is not too old. Generally, abortions in this country tend to be conducted around 6 to 8 weeks following fertilization. And if one goes beyond that age, let's say 10 weeks after fertilization, the survival drops markedly, and if one goes even further, there is no survival. Second important factor is maintaining sterility of the material being used. So we have to make sure that the tissue we're using is being treated in a sterile way, and that the women undergoing abortion are not infected by any virus. Third important parameter, I would say, is the actual dissection. It's important because we want the right cells to go in the brain. It's important in another way. We want to avoid non-brain tissue that's stuck to the brain. As the nervous system develops, bits of things that will eventually end up as cartilage, bone, skin are very closely attached to the brain tissue. And those bits have to be removed. We call these bits mesenchymal tissue. And it's been seen in animal experiments. If one isn't careful and grafts this tissue, it will grow into big bits of skin and so on. And that's not something we want. So that's very important.
In the operating room, neurosurgeon Stigrin Krona opens a hole in George's skull. Today, he will implant fetal tissue into the right side of George's brain. In 2 weeks' time, he will repeat the procedure, implanting into the left side. This will be the first such bilateral transplant in history. The dissected fetal material is ready. This tray contains the nigral cells from 3 aborted fetuses. If the surgery works, these immature cells will become part of George's brain, doing what they were designed to do, make dopamine. Only very young brain cells can adapt in this way, but young brain cells are very delicate and must be handled with extreme care. Even with all the precautions being taken, less than 10% of the cells Patrick Brunden started with will survive to grow in George's brain. The atmosphere is electric. Every detail has to be carried out with precision. Before it can be inserted, the fetal tissue must be placed in a suspension, which the neurosurgeon will carefully draw up into a thin metal instrument, especially designed for this operation. The skill and knowledge of dozens of scientists, doctors, and technicians are all focused on George. Because to cure George of his Parkinsonism might mean that Parkinson's disease is curable. The moment of truth has arrived. The careful hands of the surgeon are poised to attempt a miracle.
So they're going to do animation now, so if you're squeamish, it'll be okay.
The tissue begins its journey into the brain. When it has reached its precise position, it will be deposited. Today, the surgeon will make 3 implants into the putamen, and 1 here to the nearby caudate nucleus. Once in place, the doctors hope the cells will be fooled into thinking they are part of George's brain, start making connections with surrounding brain tissue, and eventually begin secreting dopamine. The brain is an immunologically tolerant place, so the doctors do not expect rejection to be as much of a problem as with hearts and kidneys. But George will take immunosuppressant drugs from now on. After 5 hours, the operation nears completion. For the anxiously watching Dr. Langston, it is the climax of a drama which began 7 years earlier in San Jose.
When I think back to when I first saw George in the emergency room in 1982 and had, of course, no idea what was going on, I would have never believed that we would have come to this point. It would have seemed like science fiction to me. It's truly remarkable to think back to then and look at what we're seeing now, which is, I think, very exciting.
After his 2 operations, George rested. His Swedish hosts did all they could to make him feel at home. The surgery had gone well, but would it work?
Sometimes I have where students go, oh my God, he's smoking cigarettes. Okay, we'll deal with his cigarette addiction later. The man just had brain surgery. Does that make sense? Like, don't, cut him a little bit of slack. We can deal with the other issue later. It's like, please.
Back in California, at first, George did not seem to be any better. Months went by, and then a year. But gradually, as the neurons matured, he started to improve.
Would you do that?
After 2 years, the change was unmistakable.
And then just walk. Okay? And now we're getting arm swing, which he lost completely, a nice full gaze, and back again, George. That's really extraordinary. Kind of walk right by him. Wouldn't have noticed.
While his speech was still affected, George was no longer frozen. Even when completely off all medication, he could at times move almost normally. The second patient selected for surgery was Juanita. Like George, the improvement took a little time, but was unmistakable. For the first time in years, she was able to do things for herself, like sweep and clean. Last November, she set out by herself to fly from her home in Montana to California, where Håkan Widner and Bill Langston were waiting to assess her progress.
Juanita. Come on in. Why don't you have a seat right here, okay? Good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
When's the last time you were down here? It's been
Almost a year.
almost a year. It's the first time I've seen you looking almost as good as you did before this happened. Now I'd like you to take this finger, touch the tip of my finger and your nose back and forth, okay?
Over a period of 2 years, Doctors Widner and Langston had repeated the same objective tests: tapping fingers, turning hands, walking up and down. The measurements had been done with patients on medication and off medication. All the tests had been videotaped so that changes could be documented. 2 years before, unless she received huge doses of L-Dopa, Juanita froze up. Getting out of a chair was a major challenge.
This is in real time. And again, if you imagine like having a job or trying to do basic stuff, how could you do that?
Today, it's a different story.
Go ahead on over there.
Her medication has been drastically reduced, and Langston is considering taking her off L-Dopa altogether.
I'm impressed. And back once more. Oh, that's great. That's just excellent. Good. Have a seat. Nothing more to do. That's just super.
For the Swedish team, who had invested so much time and effort, the results were gratifying.
Because she has to make, yeah.
Juanita, if somebody else was thinking about this procedure, having the transplant, what would you tell them? What would you tell them?
Go for it.
Go for it. All right.
But to convince other scientists to go for it, the Swedish team needed more evidence than just the videotapes and the clinical test data. So George and Juanita were flown to Vancouver for a PET scan. In this test, radioactive dopamine is injected into the bloodstream, and a special camera visualizes the way it's absorbed into the brain. This is what a normal person's PET scan looks like, someone without Parkinson's disease. The red patches show where the dopamine is absorbed. This is George's PET scan, before he had surgery. After surgery, you can see he's not completely normal, but there is a big improvement. The same kind of change can be seen with Juanita's PET scan, before and 2 years after surgery. But calculations based on the scans reveal what the team feared. Only 10% of the fetal cells have survived transplantation.
Only 10% of the tissue that we put in survived. At least in these patients, we've proven that's enough. And I think one of the keys to the future, to perhaps more complete reversal of Parkinsonism, may be getting a much higher survival rate of the graft.
But will the surgery that worked so well for George and Juanita work in old people with real Parkinson's disease? Or will the grafted cells be harmed by the continuing disease?
I think if it turns out that whatever causes real Parkinson's disease is attacking the graft, there are a number of things one could do. One of the most exciting areas of research in this decade is called neuroprotection, the strategy of protecting neurons. We have one drug known as Depronel, which came out of MPTP research, that may have a protective effect against the causative agent Parkinson's disease. There are now new strategies to protect and help neurons recover using gangliosides, work that was done with MPTP models.
Okay, I'm on the other side, too.
If you're a patient, I think you should be encouraged. I think this provides hope.
Just right your hands.
But in my opinion, at least, it's not something that you should consider being in your immediate future. I think we have a lot of work yet to do to improve the procedure, to assess the long-term implications, not to mention the enormous problems of doing this in large numbers of patients.
But how long must Connie wait to be freed from her private prison?
If you would have known Connie before, she was a very outgoing person, very happy and very helpful with other people, very kind. And that's why when we see her now, it's just like a really completely different person. And she's missed out on so much. And it's really, you know, it's hard for her too, because I know you see her sometimes, but she gets so depressed, and sometimes I think that she just gives up. And we try to talk to her and tell her, don't give up, you know, she'll get better. And you know, thanks to Dr. Langston, you know, he's really kept up with her. I really appreciate him. You know, he's really helped us out a lot.
And one of the things you have to think about, so what do you think, how much do you think insurance helps for carers for her day in, day out after all this? Lots? Not so much. So the ability, does that make sense, a family to take care of? If somebody doesn't have lots of extended family to help, all of that stuff, you have to think about the impact. It's not just directly on our.
And now we find out about this operation, so we've all got our hopes on that. And you know, we're just praying that it will work. So.
Earlier this year, the Swedes agreed to operate on Connie. It will be months, even years, before there are any results, but Nova will report on how she does and where this extraordinary tale leads next.
In many ways, I've always thought this story would not make good fiction. It's just too unbelievable. An illicit chemist making a bad, tainted batch of a designer drug, synthetic heroin, causes a whole group of young people to freeze up in what they call the walking death around here. Turns out to have a tremendous impact on research on a disease, a major neurodegenerative disease. All hope seems gone for these young people, and yet suddenly there's this new, radical, controversial operation in Sweden. There's hope, and these very same addicts whose fate looks so bleak are some of the first people to go to Sweden for this experimental procedure that conceivably could open up a whole new way of treating many diseases. Who would believe that?
News shows and stuff like that. I know he's got silvery hair, but he's super famous. So a couple things. So we're going to be talking about Parkinson's and other treatments, but I have 10 minutes, and the next section is 15 minutes video and then lecture and then another video and that stuff. But I want to talk about Connie really quickly. So I'm not that good. I'm good at searching some stuff, but Nova never did a follow-up video on her, but I had one of my lovely students who are super good at hunting things like that. Finally found an update with her, and they did do the surgery, and they did an update about, I think it was about 1.5 years or 2 years after, and they did a short write-up, not through Nova, but through another source, and she's apparently doing well, but they never did like another video. I suspect she wanted to have her privacy protected, which I completely get. But she's
Was there any information on the PET scans, like, compared to the other two patients?
Not that was on that little tiny, it was literally, like, my impression of the blurb that they were able to find was that it was sort of like to let everybody know she's okay, do you know what I mean? But then I think she didn't want, I assume it's similar, but it was literally like a tiny little text blurb, no photos, no imagery, nothing at all, and no follow-up to do with that.